Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, um, conversation um, hosted by the Editors Guild of India, where we'll be talking with Professor Rasmus Kleis Nielsen. I hope I got the pronunciation right, on a subject of critical importance and uh, urgent, um, I would say, with major implications for media in general around the world and in particular Indian media, which is basically the impact of wars, disruption, artificial intelligence um, on the media. Um, I think Professor Nielsen needs no introduction to anyone who has um, been in a newsroom or managed a newsroom, particularly as newsrooms have transformed from traditional media to digital first orientations, because he's been the annual Reuters Institute Digital Media report for more than a decade now, a report which is closely studied, analyzed, and digested by practically every newsroom manager in the world. Um, He's been he's a professor of communications at the University of Copenhagen, a leading global authority on not just the media, but also on how the media reports on and is shaped by conflict, technology disruptions, and even and also the evolution of um, alternative media, which have sort of impacted the traditional news media as we know it. He's the author of a number of books and one of the world's leading authorities, particularly on digital media. Thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Nielsen. Welcome. Uh, Today's discussion will follow the following format. Uh, I, uh, Professor Nielsen, I would request Professor Nielsen to first share his thoughts for about 30 minutes or so. After that, we will open the floor for questions. The questions will be moderated by Shrenik Rao, who's a senior member of the Editors Guild of India, the editor of the Madras Courier, and a member of the Guild's International Relations Committee, who's been principally responsible for organizing today's conversation. So I would request Shrenik to moderate the questions and keep the conversation flowing after Professor Nielsen is finished. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Raghavan, for the kind introduction, and thanks, Shrenik, for the invitation to join this conversation today. I'll offer my perspective, and then I really look forward to the conversation because I want to learn from your own experience and your own perspectives on these issues, from the situation in India, from your own professional experience, and from your own personal perspective. So I've been asked to speak to war, to the mass layoffs and disruptions that we see in the news media in many parts of the world, including historically very privileged parts of the world, and the issue of AI and how that might impact the role of journalism and news media in our societies today. So I'll speak to each of these three issues. And I should stress that I wear sort of two hats here in the sense that on the one hand, I'm a scientist, and scientists deal in evidence, in fact, and in analysis. And I'll put that at the center of how I speak to these issues, the research I have done, the research that I've done with others, the research I'm aware of from other researchers across the globe. But it's also, as the title of the conversation today suggests, an age of disruption, where there are uncertainties, there are things we took for granted that may not hold in the future. And we should, of course, always be wary of sort of projecting past performance into the future, in particular, a moment of disruption like this. So I also come here as a citizen, trying to make sense of the world that we live in, and a citizen that appreciates every day the work of journalists and editors around the world in helping me do that. So in that sense, I'll also come with some humility here, and offer some uncertainties, and therefore also a particular appetite for your perspectives on this. So with that preamble to business, um, we can maybe start with war. Um, I spent the first sort of 20 years of my adult life thinking that we lived in a world in which major hot wars were a thing of the past. But of course, that has not been the case in recent years, and most vividly illustrated with the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran in recent weeks. So the first thing to speak to, I think, is this question of how U.S. and other Western, broadly speaking, media are positioned to cover this war in terms of long-standing issues that we know from much research about how media in these parts of the world operate, but also some more contemporary contextual shifts, in particular in the United States of America. I think the long-standing issues include just very basic things that I think citizens may sometimes overlook, but you as editors are keenly aware of, which is just the practicalities of what it means to report on a war far away. It's expensive, it's inconvenient, it's difficult. There is a heavy reliance on agency copy, on information provided by authorities and others who are eager to interpret these events on your behalf, on our behalf, as the public. Because practically, even if one had the resources, for many media across the world, access to Iran is limited. It's tightly controlled. Journalists who do get visas have government assigned minders, they have appointed translators, and they have to assume at every moment that the regime knows where they are and who they are speaking to. And of course, this makes it more difficult to do enterprise reporting on the ground. And everything else being equal, it makes news media more reliant on things that they have access to from existing sources and things they could do from their desk. Open source intelligence is, I think, a tremendous resource, and one in which we have a much stronger profession today than we had in recent imperial adventures around the world, in Afghanistan and Iraq in the recent past. So practically, there are some long-standing issues. I think we're maybe slightly better off as a profession because of the new tools and the wealth of data online. There are pitfalls, of course. There are difficulties defining what's actually true and what is old material being repurposed. But I have tremendous respect and admiration for the work of the open source intelligence community and the fact-checking communities that I think have really helped journalism rise to that challenge and make the most of those opportunities. These are longstanding practical issues. I think there are also some longstanding cultural issues that we just need to carry with us. There's nothing particularly new about this, but they are also important for making sense of how journalism makes sense of a war like this. So culturally, we know from shelves full of research that Western newsrooms tend to privilege domestic politicians as authoritative sources, and index their coverage to the range of political and elite opinion in their own country and in countries that are regarded as longstanding allies, with less attention to how things are seen elsewhere. We have seen this, I think, very clearly in Western news media coverage of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine versus the war in Gaza, where it's been, I think, much more obvious to many journalists and editors across the world and the public that they serve, how inconsistent what Western governments have often said about a rules-based international order is, and what constitutes a war crime and whatnot, is between these two conflicts. In ways that I have seen discussed with great clarity and openness in Indian publications, in ways that I think have not always been as central to how things were discussed in Northwestern Europe and the United States. Not because people couldn't do it, but because a lot of the daily coverage was indexed to domestic politics and domestic actors who didn't see these two situations as comparable, and thus felt entirely comfortable, on the one hand, insisting on the importance of a rule-based international order and punishing aggressors, while also at the same time seeing it fit to make a number of concessions to governments that were regarded as longstanding allies or in other ways exempt from the rules that we have learned from the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz recently uh, don't seem to be so important in some situations around the world. And sometimes this is sort of a big, almost metaphysical issue of how we cover these things, but I think it also becomes very concrete sometimes, just in terms of what are the headlines that citizens actually encounter when they see coverage. And I'll give two examples from the BBC, and I picked the BBC as an organization I have tremendous respect for and admiration for, so it's not meant to put them on the spot or suggest that there's something untowards that's particular about the BBC here, but I think it illustrates the issue of how some sources are privileged and others not. So take two headlines from BBC News Online on March 1st, so a little more than 10 days ago. One headline reads, 9 dead in missile attack on Israel as Iran strikes region. The other headline reads, at least 153 dead after reported strike on school, Iran says. Same day, same news organization, same war. In the first case, the headline is direct about what happened and who did it. Uh, there was a missile attack by Iran. In the second case, the 153 people, mostly elementary school children, are simply dead. We're not told why or how. Could have had a bad case of the flu for all we're concerned as readers. And the statement is hedged with Iran says. And of course, by now we know from reporting from sources around the world that this was not only something that Iran said. So there are some cultural challenges here, and again, there's nothing new about this, but we have to reckon with a long-standing set of issues in the profession and how the daily work works. There are also some, I think, more contemporary contextual shifts that I can sort of illustrate with the United States of America in particular, where you have a combination of some shifts in how the American public gets news, but also in terms of what the relationship is between the federal government and the US news media. And I think it's sort of a useful illustration of this is just to think about how much has actually changed in the relatively short span of time between the early parts of the Biden administration and the early parts of the current Trump administration. So back in 2021, 38% of Americans identified television as their main source of news, and 23% identified social media as the main source of news. So as recently as 5 years ago, it was still the case that a clear plurality of Americans orient themselves towards television, and if one expanded to include radio, print, and the online presence of established legacy media, it was the case that the clear majority of American citizens primarily got their news via established legacy news media in all their different forms. Today, 5 years later, the numbers are tied at 35% for television and 34% for social media. So the sort of centrality of established news media are clearly eroding in America, in the United States of America, as the sort of primary sense-making institution of our society. Of course, some of the news that people get on social media do come from journalists and news media that are recognizable as legacy organizations or their sort of digital counterparts. But a lot of it also comes from creators, from influencers, directly from political actors, from activists, from fellow citizens, and other sources. So you are keenly aware of this in India, but I do think it's worth recognizing how quick this development is and how significant the shift is in just 5 years. And it's not just in terms of where people get their news, it's also the relationship that they have with the news. So trust, I think, is a useful way of thinking about this. And it's not so much that trust has eroded further in the United States, trust in news. Actually, the headline figure is about the same. In 2021, 29% of US Americans said they had some or a great deal of trust in the news media in general. 5 years later, it's 30%, so basically unchanged. It's more that underneath the hood, what has happened in the United States is that trust in the news amongst those citizens who identify as being politically on the left has declined very significantly. even as trust in news has inched up slightly amongst people who see themselves as being politically on the right and in the center, which means we've gone from a situation in the early Biden presidency where essentially people who were on the left and relatively sympathetic to the sitting administration trusted the news, whereas most other Americans were quite skeptical, in a sense, a very polarized trust profile, to a situation today where skepticism towards the news is a much more general phenomenon in American society. There are partisan differences, but they're far less pronounced than they were. And in the sense, we have a more generalized skepticism towards the news media from much of the public in the US. Finally, this change in context, of course, is not only about the relationship between the news media and the public and how people get their news. It's also about the relationship between political actors and the news media, most importantly here, the federal government. And it's clear, I think, to every observer that the situation here is categorically different today from what it was 5 years ago, and that many of the most important individual news media in America today face tremendous direct pressure from the federal government directly on them, and in some cases, perhaps more importantly, on their proprietors. So, just to take the most high-profile examples, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal both face major lawsuits from Trump, and are frequently and very publicly criticized and attacked by the president and his surrogates. Both have said that they face these lawsuits with confidence, but they still have to deal with them, and this can be expensive and time-consuming. ABC News has settled a defamation lawsuit. Its owner, the Walt Disney Company, has many regulatory sensitive business interests far beyond the news. CBS News has also settled a lawsuit and installed Barry Weiss as editor-in-chief, explicitly tasked with changing its editorial direction. And CBS News, proprietor Paramount Skydance, of course, also has many regulatorily sensitive business interests far beyond the news. Trump is also going after CNN. Its current owner, Warner Bros., has many regulatorily sensitive business interests far beyond the news. And after Netflix's decision to withdraw its offer, it may soon find other owners with, you guessed it, regulatorily sensitive business interests far beyond the news. And in these situations, it's perhaps not necessarily so much that the newsroom itself has a lot of exposure and a lot of legal liability. But I think for an outside observer, it's hard not to notice that a lot of the organizations that settle are part of much larger business enterprises that have other touch points with the federal government, including touch points where the federal government has a lot of discretionary authority. I'm not saying this is why they decided to settle. I have no particular insight into that. But I think it is clear that the risk-reward calculation is different for larger corporations that may find proposed mergers blocked or find other trouble that can be very costly for their proprietors and their owners. And of course, this is a situation that may resonate with some of you in terms of the situation elsewhere in the world. And of course, it's not only about the news media. So President Trump has publicly threatened Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg with life in jail and openly speculated that Meta's abrupt policy shift in content moderation, including ending its fact-checking program in the United States, was, as President Trump himself put it, motivated by my threats. So, of course, every federal administration has had a contentious issue with the news media. That's been the case for every presidency for all of recorded history. But in recent memory, this is really is a uniquely hostile administration vis-a-vis major news organizations in America. And it's clear that some news organizations and some proprietors are adjusting to this pressure in different ways. Even as, of course, others, because we shouldn't see this as sort of monolithic, the news media versus the administration, such as Fox News, but also others, are and have been openly pro-Trump and pro-Republican for a while in a lot of their opinion and commentary, just as some social media proprietors, most importantly Elon Musk, have been openly and pro-Trump for a while. The difference now is that it's not simply a question of whether you're pro or contra, it's that the man in the political movement you're taking a position on holds the levers of power and have clearly been willing to use them and are unbound in more ways than one. And of course, news media face this with dwindling resources. And this, I think, is the second thing I wanted to speak to briefly, which is the mass layoffs we see in many newsrooms across the world, including, again, in sort of privileged high-income countries. I think by now we have a pretty clear sense of what the basic dynamics are of the business of news in a digital media environment. It's an environment in which news organizations used to build a thriving business in a low choice environment where I, as a media user, had limited options, and as a consequence, publishers had considerable market power both over advertisers who wanted to buy my attention and over me as a member of the public. Now we live in a world in which I have high choice. Publishers, as a consequence, have low market power, and the market power instead resides with those who are very successful at building gargantuan audiences and collecting enormous amounts of detailed data about our behavior, and who now control the main means of distribution of digital content. So news organizations that used to think of themselves as news companies, but really were in the distribution of service information and advertising business, really are news companies now. And have to make their living off the news. And it turns out that that is very hard in a high choice environment where there is an incredibly intense competition for attention, and where we as consumers have and citizens have tremendous abundance of things to choose from. So as users drift away, advertisers who never cared about the news follow them. They always want to buy our attention, not support the news. So advertising revenues are dwindling. Reader revenue has been an important cause for optimism in the industry as a whole. We have seen now conclusively the reputation of the assumption that no one wants to pay for digital news. In mature markets, we have a sort of sizable minority paying for digital news by now, but we also see the headline number of people paying for news stalling at different levels in different countries. So that seems to be a fairly saturated market in many countries with a sizable minority, but also no headline growth anymore. So reader revenue significant, but stalling in many cases. And in this environment, we are seeing very pronounced winner takes most dynamics, where markets that used to be differentiated largely by distribution technology, so that every town had its own newspaper, every region had its own broadcasting players, and often those markets were effectively local monopolies or oligopolies. Now, in a digital environment where geography is no longer a meaningful differentiator and no longer structures the marketplace, we see very pronounced winner takes most dynamics, with a limited number of generally upmarket general interest news titles doing really well for themselves in the context of an otherwise diminished industry, and a significant number of very clearly differentiated small niche propositions also doing very well for themselves in this market, but lots of titles in the middle that are either reasonably good but not the best and at what they offer nationally, or historically, locally, and regionally dominant players, but now faced with a sort of deterritorialized competition for attention and advertising, are struggling to find ways ahead. So this is working really well for some news organizations. I mean, the New York Times newsroom is much bigger than it's ever been in its history. I think the last figure I've seen is more than 3,000 journalists. They historically had a newsroom of about 2,000. I think they hit a bottom of about 1,500. So really successful. And they're not alone. They're the most prominent example of it, but they're not alone. Across Europe, we see those upmarket general interest news organizations who've been willing and able to invest in providing digital news on the users, meeting the users where they are, and meeting the product expectations that people have in a world where they also enjoy Spotify and Netflix are doing well for themselves. That goes for Dagens Nyheter in Sweden. It goes for Sanoma in Finland. It goes for NRC in the Netherlands. It goes for Le Monde in France. So we see a growing number of these individual titles who are doing well, even as the industry itself remains very challenged and very disrupted. And some of them are new entrants, Denigen in Slovakia, Zetland in Denmark, and others. So it's a mixed picture. I mean, the top line revenues for the industry are clearly dwindling, and I expect them to dwindle for some time to come. But the impacts are very different across the industry, with a few winners among some of the biggest players and most prominent players, a significant number of niche players, but far from everyone doing well, and then a lot of other players that are really, really under tremendous pressure and are struggling to find a way through. If we turn from that business analysis of the current environment towards the future, and this, of course, is then where AI comes in. I think we can see right now that the already quite challenging position of established news publishers is likely to grow more challenging in the years ahead. Because in a sense, the more distribution takes place on platforms that don't give a categorical advantage to certain legacy players just because they've been around for a long time, or because of the values that they represent, or because the special position that they aim or claim to serve in our society, as more and more of the competition for attention takes place on these platforms, that competition for attention is intensified by, on the one hand, the explosion of creator and influencer content. We have faced this for some years, but it's really coming to a head now with the maturation and growth of this as a organized, large-scale, significant sector competing with other sources of content for attention on platforms. So on the one hand, sort of artisanal content from this growing universe of creators and others. And of course, then on the other hand, the increasing role for automation of AI-generated content. So not the long-standing use of AI for ranking content, ranking algorithms, retrieval algorithms, whether for retrieval requests or recommended content, but also the actual generation of content that itself competes with other sources for our attention through summaries and instant outputs to our queries or interests as users. So this leads me to the last bit about AI, and then I'll say a few things in summary and then look forward to the discussion. AI is going to be a key part of the context. We also, I think, should recognize that at this stage, even though the user uptake of generative AI in the form of chatbots in Northwestern Europe and in North America right now is happening about twice as fast as the uptake of the consumer internet in the 1990s, so very rapidly. That, like the impact of the uptake of the consumer internet in the 90s, does not mean that things change overnight. Even if they will change, I think, quite fundamentally in the medium term, it does not change things overnight. And generative AI so far is still a very niche source of news, and it is rarely regarded as the most important source of news, even by the few who use it as a source of news. So far, I think the real impact of that is still in the future, and the most important things we see right now are, of course, all the interesting ways in which journalists and editors and news organizations use these tools, often at the back end, but also in the way in which it has essentially reduced the cost of producing content at scale to near zero. So you see the sort of automation of content that sometimes we might think of as sort of mis or disinformation, but more commonly is simply, I think, what people call AI slop, so sort of low quality content. Not terrible, not false, not malicious necessarily, but not particularly impressive either. And I think we really need to recognize that we see this at scale also from very prestigious and powerful and privileged actors in society. As anyone who opens LinkedIn will notice, you see a lot of this boilerplate text coming from very self-important people who clearly are using these tools to just make sure that they post several times a day with generic stuff aligned with their brand. So we see some malicious uses, but I think more fundamentally, we see just an explosion of content from many different sources that can offer distraction, entertainment, diversion of attention, and of course, hence also potentially a time of advertising. We've seen OpenAI announce that they will integrate advertising into what they are doing. So I expect the business pressures around advertising to further intensify. And the flip side of this for news organizations, of course, is the exciting potential of what we can do with these tools. And we are seeing some really interesting and innovative use in some cases, but also further business issues around um, is there a business opportunity here in a context where the conventional and long established de facto terms of trade between publishers and platforms that platforms offered audience reach in return for access to publishers' content are really changing quite dramatically when we are looking at a world in which we are no longer in the world of search, where five index crawls might produce one referral, but in a world of generated content where it might take 10,000 crawls to generate a single referral, where the terms of trade are so far away from what publishers have acquiesced to in the past that it really is difficult, I think, for many publishers to see what the commercial upside is of making their content available as training and grounding data for AI bots, and where I think we have to face the what seems to me to be a still very unclear legal situation where AI companies industrial scale use of publishers' copyright protected intellectual property for both training and ground purposes in a moral sense, I think can very convincingly and clearly be described essentially as theft, as many creatives and many publishers are. And I entirely understand that. And I think many citizens are very responsive to that framing. But we should, of course, also remember that legally there is a presumption of innocence. And it's not actually clear legally that this is, in a legal sense, theft that requires licensing. And if we look at the behavior of the AI companies, it seems that so far they do not feel that they want to or have to pay for news content. If they felt they had to or wanted to, they would do it. There is no shortage of money. They are spending billions on chips and data centers and engineering talent. But the few deals we see for content are few. From what we know in public life, I think it's well under 1% of publishers globally who have any kind of content licensing deal with AI companies of any sort, let alone one that results in direct cash payments. And for the few companies where we have some sense of what the deals actually look like, we're looking at something in the region of 1% incremental revenue. So not nothing, but not exactly a game changer in terms of the volumes of money involved. So I think quite a rocky road ahead that probably necessitates the creation of some kind of legal clarity, um, which then returns us to the question of the relationship between publishers and people in positions of power, because who can establish that clarity? That is, of course, often governments, and the same governments with which publishers historically have had a sort of on and off relationship and like to see themselves as independent watchdogs. So where does all this leave us? I mean, I think long-standing issues are still with us. We shouldn't forget that just because there is a lot of new stuff going on, we have well-established issues we still need to deal with. In Western media, that means reckoning with journalism's sometimes uncomfortable proximity to people in positions of power, the risk of parochialism in covering global conflicts from the point of view of only one region, and just the challenging reporting it takes to really understand a war on the ground. We have more contemporary issues, which has to do with the fraying connection between much of the public and much of journalism and news media. And then more specific problem in some countries, but far from all, where politicians are clearly and unabashedly aggressively using the levers of power they have to try to influence the behavior of newsrooms and their proprietors, even if those organizations otherwise have plenty of resources, plenty of journalists, plenty of money. But when they're faced with powerful politicians, sometimes they make concessions anyway. This is a challenging environment, but the last thing I will say is that even though it is very challenging, journalism has always been challenging and sometimes been far more challenged in the past. Britain was not exactly hospitable to independent journalism in India historically. And we should also recognize, of course, that there are people doing amazing work also under these difficult circumstances in every part of the world, but also in America, despite the federal administration's hostility to many forms of journalism. We know because of the work of journalists that the federal government has often ignored court orders, that it's killed people in the streets, that the Trump family seems to be doing really well for itself financially. So despite the challenges, we should also just recognize the incredible value of the work that the best of journalism has to offer also today. With that, I'll stop and I look forward to our discussion. So over to you, Srenik.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. That was really very insightful, interesting, and very valuable perspectives. So I'd like to start by asking you one question before I open the floor to the audience. Do you think with artificial intelligence and using artificial content that is scraped from artificial intelligence bots, basically AI agents, there is a risk of sanitizing news that is generated for various reasons?
Sanitizing? Sorry, say more. I'm not
Yeah.
sure I
So
understand.
let me give you
Oh,
an example.
oh,
So, for example, if we were to put Pete Hegseth's quote, which is basically death and destruction from the
mhm,
sky all day long,
mhm.
or we will
Yep,
hunt you down,
yep,
and retribution against, etc. If
mhm.
we put that into news generation AI, news generating AI agents, they will simply come out with sanitized version of a news piece instead of that particular quote. So what is available on television on what he has actually said is taken and sanitized and published as, say, for example, a news report. Is there a large?
Yeah, thanks, Frank.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I see what you mean. I mean, I think there is a risk of that happening. I think it's important to remember that the sort of large language models that underlie the tools that are most commonly used for these things, whether by individual consumers or by enterprises, are not really meant to deliver a sort of a sharp news verdict, right? I mean, they're meant to generate a probabilistic estimate of what a human expression on this topic could look like, and they will, everything else being equal, often tend to sort of veer towards the moderate and average, and that is rarely sort of sharply quoted and angled content. At the same time, I also expect that we will see over time real competition in terms of how the tools are used, so how they are prompted, how the workflows around them work in different ways, but also even about between the model developers themselves. And Elon Musk, I think, has been particularly vocal about this, that he is trying to position XAI and Grok as a sort of a model and that is aligned on different values than the main corporate competitors, and is much more willing to express things that are very, very polemical and hard-hitting. And of course, there's been major controversies around this, and even worse stuff than that because of this. But I expect to see that we will see a number of LLMs trying to product differentiate themselves on the basis of what kind of content they produce, even separately from how these tools are being prompted and used by individuals and corporations.
So we have a question here from Sanjay. Do you fear that aggressive nationalism is impacting journalism and the coverage of war, primarily from you know driven by artificial intelligence and also this desire to present themselves as close to the administration?
Thank you. I mean, I think that's a long-standing issue in journalism. That there is a real tendency, and it's not only journalists, I mean, it's also politicians and members of the public. There is a real tendency to rally around the flag in times of crisis, in particular military crisis, and sort of move from being seeing oneself as reporting on and sometimes challenging what people in positions of power do to essentially trying to sort of cheerlead them. I think those of you who report in India can think of one or two examples, and perhaps more than that, of this happening elsewhere too. I don't think we need AI to worry about this. I think it's a ever-present worry, that there are moments in which what aims to be independent, autonomous, impartial political journalism turns into essentially a sort of a standard version of sports journalism, cheering on one team, only in this case in matters of life and death.
There's another question from a member who's joined us. So it says, with platforms like Google, Meta, and X controlling much of the distribution of news, has journalism effectively become dependent on technology companies?
I mean, I think in one sense, clearly, yes. They have, in the sense that I think at a very basic level, everyone expressing themselves in public, whether they do it for intrinsic purposes, for strategic purposes, or because they have intrinsic purposes but also need to make a living off it. So in the last category, I would include publishers and journalists, need to find their place in a world in which we, as members of the public, increasingly rely on platforms to navigate content and information. And that means that publishers and others can decide not to engage with technology companies or some individual technology companies, but they also need to accept that the consequences of that choice is that they are surrendering the possibility of audience reach via that platform, and by extension also leaving commercial opportunities to be pursued by others who will pursue them. Creators and others will fill that gap, of course. And there are some publishers who have decided to do this from time to time. The Times of London famously stepped away from Google search and then came back. Stuff, a major publisher in New Zealand, stepped away from Facebook in the aftermath of the company's very poor handling of the Christchurch massacre. Later, they at least partially returned. The Guardian has stepped away from X, though it has stressed that its journalists can still be on X, and they'll still use X in its reporting. So there are moments in which some publishers and journalists step away from the technology companies. But the real decision, I think, in a sense, is how each of us think about the balance between platform opportunities, what they enable us to do, and then the platform risks. We are becoming dependent on the tools that empower us, each of us as individuals, but also publishers.
Great. So we have a question from Rajdeep Sardesai, a very well-known journalist. He asks, how much is Islamophobia driving Western narratives of the war?
I mean, there is a research that documents that Western news media have often covered Muslim populations, both in their own countries and elsewhere, in very stereotyped and prejudiced manners, and have reproduced very negative and prejudiced and stereotyped representations of Islam and of Muslims and of people who may not be religiously devout but are rounded of countries and cultures that historically have identified as Muslim. So I would just say that I think there is clear research evidence to suggest that this is a factor, and I think it would be. I think the burden of evidence is on those who claim otherwise, whether we look at the war in Iran or the treatment of the war in Gaza or the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq. I think the evidence as far as I can tell suggests that this is a factor, and people who disagree, I think, need to show receipts.
There's one other question from Paneer Selvan, Paneer Selvan, and he asks, how do you understand the unified singular readings of world affairs and the cost of plural voice? How can we look at proliferation rather than multiple voices? There is a sort of a monolithic version of world events that are still being presented, despite the so-called democratization of knowledge.
Yes. I mean, I think the spaces in which we see the most diversity are often spaces that can be deeply problematic for other reasons. In part because they don't aggressively police, either automatically or professionally, a uniformity that can often end up being aligned with sort of a dominant or hegemonic narrative. I'm thinking here of research done by collaborations between Palestinian individuals and Israeli scholars critical of the Netanyahu government's war in Gaza that have looked at how X as a platform that is infamously laissez-faire with its content moderation and infamously accepting of extremely polemical and sometimes tendentious presentations of public affairs has in some ways been a very important space for alternative and different and challenging interpretations of the one Gaza, precisely because it is an extremely permissive space for some forms of expression. So I think it's and it doesn't have to be only X. I mean, I think each of us can sort of think of spaces for some communities. Reddit is such a platform. For some communities, there might be particular online publications or even closed forums on Discord or Twitch or elsewhere where people who really see things radically differently from the majority dominant views find one another, express themselves, connect as communities of interest and practice. I don't mean to romanticize any of these spaces because, of course, the same affordances can allow truly toxic subcultures to gather and can allow for the dissemination of hate at scale. And again, I think we can think of examples of this happening also in India. But often, I think the virtues and vices of these environments are two sides of the same coin. And I do think that this issue of a much more fundamental recognition of the irreducible plurality of our societies and, of course, the world at large can be more fully expressed in some of these environments that are very laissez-faire in their content moderation.
So that brings us to a slightly more issue of journalism and editorial credibility. And there's a very interesting question here. It says, if journalism's credibility historically depended on experienced reporters, editors, and investigative teams, what happens to the institutional capacity when economic pressure steadily shrinks the newsrooms? How
Sorry, Shrenik, your sound dropped out for a bit, so I only got the first part of the question, but I think I understand the question in terms of what happens essentially to investigative and enterprise reporting in a context of shrinking resources, if that was the sort of the basis for its authority. I mean, I don't think one should sugarcoat that this is a real challenge. This is a real threat. Like proper investigative enterprise reporting requires resources. Those resources are dwindling and shrinking in many cases. I think there is a very real risk to that. And it's a risk that is very hard to document and quantify because at a very basic level, we don't know what we don't know, right? We don't know of the corruption that's never revealed. We don't know of the abuses of power that are never revealed. We don't know of all the things that we could have known had there been enterprise reporting and investigative reporting to uncover it and bring it to the light of day. So I think it's a very real challenge. I will say that at the same time, resources are a necessary but not sufficient condition for investigative reporting. And I think that sometimes we need to also see that in some cases, very precariously positioned organizations with very limited resources and none of the size and muscularity and security of large established news organizations have done some of the most important enterprise reporting and investigative reporting. I don't mean to romanticize precarity. I mean, it's not ideal to be done under those conditions, but sometimes there is a autonomy and freedom of action that comes from smaller teams and some of these smaller teams don't have the proprietorial entanglements that I think can sometimes limit the ability or will of some larger news organizations to actually engage in independent investigative reporting. So sometimes it's better to be small and free than to be
That
large and bound.
that also builds us into brings us to the next question, which is very relevant to what you just said, which is, while influencers, standalone journalists are becoming popular in this new age, do you think they have an intrinsic disadvantage with regard to longevity, as they may not have the advantage like that of a news media room?
Yeah, I
It's a
see what you
valid.
mean. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, there is a, I think the simplifying and exaggerating, and this will not be strictly true or precise in every context, but just as a way to think of it. The way I think of it is that um, in a number of cases and countries, far from everywhere, far from everyone, journalism effectively became a profession in the sense of being a sort of a stable occupation that afforded lifelong careers and a clear set of job opportunities within an identifiable industry. This was not always so. It was never so for everyone. It was never so everywhere. But I think we can all see what I mean, right? I mean, this is, I think, what many of us in Europe and North America think of as journalism, and in parts of India too. Most of the sort of creator and influencer space is not going to be like that. It's going to be much more like the way in which the art and culture industries have long been. A huge intake at the bottom of enormous amounts of talented, motivated, creative, gung-ho, can-do young people who will work incredibly hard with great passion and dedication for some years. And then a tiny percentage of those will actually make a living off it. And many others will, over time, decide to spend their time and energy and efforts otherwise, pursue other vocations, other careers. And of the ones who actually make it, a tiny percentage will in turn actually make a lot of money. So much more a sort of a freelance, precarious, highly unequal labor market, more akin to the movie industry with actors, published authors, music, much more like that than the idea of a sort of a lifelong professional full-time career with stable employment. And in that sense, our project journalism will begin to look like this as well. And of course, as I said, journalism has long been like that for many people in many places, very precarious and not a
So,
lifelong career.
so does that mean that journalistic jobs are under threat from AI? If so, massive threat from AI. And if so, what type of journalistic jobs do you think will be most under threat?
This is really, I think, is one of those areas where we're into the terrain of uncertainty. Um, um, I will say that I do think it's quite striking when you hear the editors and executives of some of the most respected and forward-looking news publishers in Europe that are sort of admired across the world for their leadership in developing AI solutions for journalism on the base of high editorial standards and a successful commercial operation. Companies such as Schibsted, Bonnier, and others in the Nordic region, Sanoma from Finland, the Sanoma Group. I've heard several of those people say that in their view, the ability to write and edit text will not be an important journalistic skill in the future because
Mhm.
they believe that the standard off-the-shelf tools will be so good at that
Mhm.
that the real value add is going to be around reporting and analysis and creative storytelling in a much wider sense. Whereas a sort of just classic act of actually writing out the stories and editing the text, that is still such a big part of many journalists' work. And of course, historically, has been a very large part in newspapers in particular. From their point of view, that is work that lends itself very well to automation.
Mhm. There is a very interesting question which has come again from Mr. Prakash Dubey. It asks, do you think that the organizations, including the UNO, NATO, have lost their relevance in this situation? What should the international media organizations do?
I mean, I think I'll sort of answer in two parts. And I mean, the first one is I don't know. I mean, and I suppose in this case, I'm not an expert. And frankly, I think the experts I know who work on the role of international organizations will also say that they don't know. And this is one of those areas where it really feels like we're in a Zeitungswende, as the Germans say, a sort of a moment of profound transition in what passes for global order. How profound? Is hotly disputed in public. And I suppose the second part of the answer then is I think back to where I started, that I think a precondition of making sense of this moment is that journalists and editors make the effort to listen to a wider range of perspectives on it than just those who happen to be the privileged domestic authoritative sources on these matters. Governments and think tanks and foreign ministries have an awful lot of skin in the game on how they interpret the present and future of the UN and NATO. Um, I would I applaud the work of journalists who try to cast a wider net than simply covering this issue on the basis of what politicians say, because we see a lot of that in Europe and America. We also see, I think, very impressive reporting on it. Again, I really want to stress that this is an incredibly uncertain period of time. It's very difficult to be a journalist and editor, even under the best of circumstances. And I feel privileged every day to benefit from the work of journalists and editors who approach this with an open mind, and don't sort of go for simply reiterating the latest soundbite or singer offered by a prominent individual who has a parochial interest in interpreting the future of these institutions in a certain way. It's up for grabs. And I think citizens rely on the work of you and your colleagues to try to navigate that uncertainty, the range of views on it, the range of probable futures, without being told with unearned confidence or spurious precision that this will be the future by people who have a stake in telling us what they think it ought to be.
On that note, Rasmus, thank you very much for this really insightful lecture. And I thank you on behalf of the Editors Guild of India, the office bearers of the Editors Guild of India would very much like to thank you for this very insightful conversation. And
Pleasure.
I'm grateful for this session.
Thank you very much, Raghavan, for introducing me, and Shrenik for the invitation. And thanks all of you for your time today and for your work. Good luck.